Jackie was 26 when she married Marcus. He was gentle, grounded, and everything her childhood hadn't been. After surviving years under her mother Jalen's narcissistic grip, Jackie believed love could rewrite her story. Jackie began to believe that if she built a life with someone safe, the past would finally stay buried. For a while it felt like healing. They had twins, James and Jocelyn, who filled their home with laughter and chaos. Jackie poured herself into motherhood, determined to give her children the emotional safety she never had. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. The panic attacks started quietly. A sudden rush of heat, a racing heart, a need to escape while thinking that a couple of drinks can calm her down. Marcus would ask, "Are you okay?" And Jackie would nod, then cry alone in the laundry room. She didn't understand why her body reacted like danger was near even when everything was calm. She immediately felt guilt as nostalgia took over at the thought of how she'd just drowned herself at the bottom of her favorite liquor bottle, and that used to be enough to get her through the night and deal with the next day. With tears rolling down her face, Jackie has a flashback of joking with a couple of girlfriends at happy hour that if she could make her favorite drink a perfume product line, she would do it and become rich. Jackie shakes her head. "My marriage is falling apart, and all I can do is reminisce about how fun it used to be just to make a fool out of myself. What happened to me?" She began emotionally shutting down. Conversations felt like landmines. Affection triggered flashbacks. She felt guilty for needing space, then guilty for needing closeness. Marcus tried to be supportive, but Jackie couldn't always explain the storm inside her. One night the tension boiled over. Marcus stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, voice tight. "You shut down every time I try to help." Jackie's hands trembled. "I don't know how to reach myself," she whispered. Her anxiety was palpable like static in the air. Marcus softened, but the damage was done. They were speaking different languages. He was rooted in logic and love, hers in survival and fear. After a particularly intense episode, Jackie sought therapy. She was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a result of prolonged narcissistic abuse. Her therapist introduced her to complex PTSD, and later, the concept of adverse childhood experiences. Jackie dove into research. She read a viral article from Psychology Today, titled, "What's the latest news on adverse childhood experiences?" It explained how ACEs like emotional abuse, neglect, and parental dysfunction were linked to chronic illnesses, obesity, depression, and even heart disease. Another study from BMC Public Health showed that people with high ACE scores had significantly higher risks of mental and physical health issues. Jackie cried reading it. Not because she wanted an excuse, but because she finally had context. Her panic attacks, her emotional shutdowns, her weight gain and social anxiety weren't character flaws. They were symptoms of a system she'd been born into. She didn't use it to justify the strain she'd caused in her marriage. She owned her mistakes, but she also forgave herself. She began journaling again. She started walking, then running. She joined support groups for survivors of narcissistic abuse and parents with PTSD. She realized her trauma hadn't ended, it had evolved, and now it was affecting her marriage, her parenting, and her sense of self. The emotional toll on James and Jocelyn was undeniable. Jocelyn withdrew, becoming quiet and anxious. James became hypervigilant, always trying to fix the mood in the house. Jackie saw herself in them and felt crushed. She didn't want her pain to become their blueprint. Eventually, the marriage fractured. Marcus, though loving, couldn't carry the weight of Jackie's unspoken grief. They divorced quietly, without blame, but the silence was heavy. Jackie felt like she'd failed again, regardless of deciding to be sure that Marcus had parental access to their children James and Jocelyn. The twins cried for weeks. Jackie cried longer. She may have lost Marcus, but she still had herself, her twins, and her story that is ever being told. In the aftermath, she turned inward. She began journaling daily, tracking her triggers and emotions. She started walking every morning, then running. The weight she'd gained from stress and social anxiety began to gradually melt, not just physically, but emotionally. Movement became medicine, and Jackie was not expecting miracles. Gratitude became more of a daily ritual as Jackie searched for solutions to overcome her personal challenges instead of wearing her pain like a badge of honor. Suffering without solutions somehow didn't feel normal anymore. But Jackie felt that giving herself permission to feel great again about anything was long overdue. Some days were hopeful. Jackie felt more like herself as she laughed with her kids, cooked dinner, went out and socialized more. Other days were brutal. Depression would wrap around her like fog. She'd cancel plans, avoid calls, and question her worth, but she kept going. She joined online support groups for survivors of narcissistic abuse. She read articles from Neurolaunch and Rula Health about how PTSD affects romantic partnerships. She learned that healing wasn't linear and that survival wasn't the end of the story. James and Jocelyn began to thrive under her gentle parenting. Jackie taught them about boundaries, emotional literacy, and self-trust. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a daily decision, and Jackie started to finally choose herself.
Let me tell you about Jackie. On the surface, her life looked pretty normal. She's a 40-year-old divorced mom with 2 kids, but underneath all that, she was dealing with these invisible scars from her past, just trying to find her own voice. Her journey is this incredibly powerful roadmap for healing, and you know what? It all started with just one single devastating sentence.
It really all begins with these chilling words from her mother, Jalen. And they weren't yelled, you know? They were delivered with this kind of ice-cold precision that, for a little kid, is just completely devastating. That one sentence became this quiet, constant echo in her head that would go on to define her entire life.
So let's fast forward to today. Jackie is a great mom to her teenage twins. She's capable, she's functional, but she's also carrying this incredibly heavy, invisible weight. Her whole life has been shaped by the unseen wounds of growing up with a narcissistic mother. That's an environment where a kid's emotional needs just get pushed aside for the parents' needs. It forces them to constantly question their own reality, their own worth.
So, you might be wondering, how did that childhood actually play out in her adult life? Well, we can see the echo of those early experiences in her marriage, in her health, and really in her fundamental sense of who she even was.
And that pattern, it just kept going right into her marriage. Her ex-husband, Marcus, even said it himself. She would just shut down. Those same old feelings of being too much or wrong were now replaying in her most intimate relationship. And all that turmoil, it started to show up physically, panic attacks, insomnia, and eventually a PTSD diagnosis. He couldn't reach her because deep down, she didn't even know how to reach herself.
After her divorce, Jackie was just adrift. She was searching for answers, and then, one late night, she had this pivotal breakthrough. This was the moment that the lock finally met its key. Can you imagine just sitting at your desk late one night, scrolling through articles, and you stumble on a term that suddenly makes your entire life make sense? For Jackie, reading about complex PTSD was like seeing her reflection clearly for the very first time. Every symptom, every shadow she'd been living with, it was all right there on the screen. And this is where it all just clicked for her. See, unlike traditional PTSD, which can come from a single event, complex PTSD comes from prolonged, repeated trauma, like being trapped in a harmful environment when you're a child. That constant stress literally changes a person's sense of self and safety in the world. And the symptoms, those emotional flashbacks, the chronic anxiety, the trouble with relationships, it was a perfect match for everything she'd been going through.
But, having a name for the pain is one thing. Finding a way to actually heal from it, well, that turned out to be a completely different and incredibly difficult journey.
And she really tried. She went to support groups, AA meetings, places where people are supposed to find their voice. But for Jackie, the anxiety was so overwhelming, her own voice just vanished. She'd find herself physically unable to speak, and she'd have to leave early, time and time again. The professional help she found at first was a study in contrasts. Her first therapist gave her this really dismissive advice, basically putting the blame back on her. But then she found a trauma-informed specialist who gave her something way more powerful than advice: validation. And this is so critical for CPTSD because this kind of therapy sees the issue not as a character flaw, but as an injury. The difference between those two approaches was everything. It was the difference between just suffering and actually starting to heal.
And that validation, that was the turning point.
It was the very first step on a real, tangible path to getting better.
These words became the absolute cornerstone of Jackie's healing. I mean, for the first time, an authority figure was telling her the exact opposite of what her mother's voice had been whispering in her ear for 40 years. It was like she was finally given permission to stop blaming herself and just start healing.
So, how'd she turn that feeling into action? Well, first, she found ways to express herself without words, like journaling and painting, to process all that emotion. Then, she looked for community where her anxiety wouldn't spike, which she found in online forums. And finally, she gently started to re-engage with the world, rebuilding her confidence through small, safe social interactions.
And all this dedicated, difficult work, it started to create these incredible, visible results. Not just for her, but for her whole family.
Her twins, James and Jocelyn, they noticed the change. They told her she was different, in a good way, that she had stopped trying to fix everything all the time and was just present. I mean, for a parent, there is no greater validation than that.
The real depth of her transformation, though, you could see it in the little moments. One night, she burned dinner. In the past, that would have sent her into a shame spiral. But this time, she just laughed. She was finally free from that impossible standard of perfection that had haunted her for so long.
But Jackie didn't stop with her own healing. No way. She turned her pain into a purpose. She launched a podcast, The Mirror Between Us, and created the exact kind of space she had once so desperately needed for herself. Through her work, she helps other survivors, especially female veterans, and she lets them know, loud and clear, that they are not alone.
And this brings us to her powerful conclusion. Standing in front of the mirror, she could finally see herself clearly. The little girl who was always made to feel like she was too much had finally realized the truth. She was always, always just enough.
Jackie's story is one of many, but it's also kind of a mirror for our own experiences, isn't it? It reminds us that healing is possible and that it starts with finding the truth. Which leaves us with one final thought. What story does your reflection tell?